Hello, everybody. It's Philip Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat, and today is Tuesday, the 27th of July, 2021. Be sure to click on the subscribe button below to subscribe to future episodes, and also the notification bell in the upper right to be notified when they come out. So today's topic is a perpetual unholy alliance. So let me begin with that now. In English-speaking countries, banking evolved among merchants in the mid-17th century. Shopkeepers normally stored their surplus gold in the king's mint for safekeeping until Charles I needed money shortly before the English Civil War in 1638. He confiscated much of the merchant's gold, calling it a loan. Although it was eventually repaid, merchants thereafter preferred to deposit their gold with private goldsmiths who issued warehouse receipts to each depositor. Such receipts basically became paper money and were preferred in many transactions in place of bulky coins. Soon, goldsmiths realized that most of their receipts would remain in circulation and rarely be presented for redemption. Therefore, they could lend money in the form of newly issued receipts, maintaining a gold inventory equal to only a fraction of the face value of the receipts outstanding. Theoretically, once such loans were repaid, the amount of the receipts remaining in circulation would be equal to the gold inventory, and the smith would have earned interest income on the loan without having spent any of his gold. Pragmatically speaking, however, new loans were constantly being created as old ones were paid off. As long as the receipts presented for redemption never exceeded the smith's gold inventory, there was no harm. But if ever a holder presented a receipt that could not be redeemed in gold, public confidence in the smith's warehouse receipts would vanish, and the paper would no longer be accepted in transactions except possibly at a discount to face value. Now, at the start of the American Civil War, about 1,600 banks operated in the above manner. There were no federal minimum reserve requirements. Regulations regarding reserve ratios and interest rates and loan activities were all set by the states individually. The nation's total currency was about 450 million, of which 250 million was specie, which means gold or silver coins. The remaining 200 million was composed of various private paper issues, meaning banknotes, the notes of the banks that had the gold reserves, for example. Now, the enormous Civil War financing needs impelled changes to the United States monetary system as federal spending grew from 80 million in fiscal 1861 to 1.3 billion in 1865. During the war, the federal debt similarly leaped from 65 million at the start to 2.7 billion at the end of the war. 65 million to 2.7 billion at the end of the war. Now, the first legislated monetary change was the 1862 Legal Tender Act, which authorized greenbacks. Although greenbacks were not redeemable in specie, the federal government tried to mandate their acceptance by declaring the bills to be, quote, legal tender for all debts, public and private. Soldiers and government employees, for example, were paid in greenbacks. And greenbacks soon became the standard currency, except for imports, which still had to be paid for in gold. A second change was the 1863 National Bank Act, which provided incentives for the first time for state banks to seek national charters. Specifically, it enabled such banks to use government bonds as a reserve instead of gold. Now, gold is valuable, but it does not pay interest. If you can have a bank in which you don't have to use gold as a reserve, but instead can use interest-bearing bonds as a reserve, and during the Civil War, they paid about 5 or 6% annually, and you got a good deal. Thus, the arrangement enabled the bankers to earn interest income twice for a fixed amount of invested capital in the bank. One source was the bank's borrowers, who paid interest on the loans the bank made to them. The other source was the federal treasury, which paid interest on the bonds that were held in reserve. Now, that lucrative arrangement remains in place to this very day, and it makes banks ever ready buyers of treasury bonds ever since the Civil War. And that is why banks are ever ready buyers of government bonds today. For the last 13 years, however, since the 2008 housing debacle, interest rates have been near zero. Thus, banks are more prone to sell the bonds they buy from the Treasury after holding them a shorter period of time. The trick to keeping the Ponzi scheme going is to find a sucker buyer to buy the bonds from the banks at higher prices so that the banks may record a profit to their shareholders when they sell the bonds. As I said, there needs to be a sucker buyer, and that is where the Federal Reserve banks step in with a program called quantitative easing. Basically, the Federal Reserve stands ready to buy the bonds from the banks at prices that enable them to record a profit. Since the Federal Reserve is merely another branch of the federal government, the scheme basically rewards commercial banks to act as a non-risk-bearing middleman in order to disguise the fact that what really is going on is that one branch of the federal government is buying the bonds from another branch, and there really is no independent buyer. Since there is no independent buyer for the bonds, quantitative easing is merely another type of Ponzi scheme. Thus, the game that the 1863 National Banking Act started may not really be perpetual. Instead, it may ultimately end catastrophically. Okay, now to learn about this, I mean, the quantitative easing is something we're facing right now in 2021, but this shows how it links back to developments, legislation during the American Civil War. Now, to understand more about this, get Philip Lee's Southern Reconstruction, which is available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and other fine bookstores for $22. If you want to get an autographed copy, you can get one from me for $25, and I'll cover the delivery here in the United States at no charge. But if you want the autograph, you got to email me, Phil, P-H-I-L _Lee, L-E-I-G-H, at me.com. Okay, that's our show for today, and thanks for watching.